Survival horror is a subgenre of action games that draws from horror fiction. Survival horror is set apart from most genres because it is not defined strictly by a gameplay mechanic but by its subject matter. Therefore, survival horror games can have dramatically different gameplay styles and still be considered survival horror. Though it has only been a defined genre for a short time, its lineage can be traced to classic games from which it draws its conventions and ideas. Adventure games were the first games that tried to use horror as a tool, such as Roberta Williams' game Mystery House. Mystery House is based on an Agatha Christie murder in which a group of people are invited to a mansion and are murdered one by one. This was an early graphical adventure game that used a text interface. The drawback to adventure games is that they always approached horror from literary perspectives, rather than trying to frighten gamers in a new way. The Atari 2600's Haunted House, developed by James Anderson, differed from the literary approach of adventure games. The game was designed with fright in mind. Haunted House emphasized what the character could not do rather than what they could. This game worked within the limited technologies of the time. In the game, all that can be seen of the character is a set of disembodied, floating eyes. The only way that a character can see anything in the game is to light a match, which is blown out by drafts when a monster enters the room. When compared to modern games, it is not very impressive, but it started to set some early conventions of the survival horror genre. Specifically, the game did not empower the character, but handicapped them. It also focused on evasion and puzzle solving rather than action and confrontation. The early Atari game, based on the film Halloween, is another notable first step in survival horror. In this game, the player also has no combat abilities, and again focuses on evasion of Mike Myers. Although this game is graphically primitive today, for its time it still had what would be a rather gruesome decapitation of its characters. During the late 80s, several games were released that used horror themes, but at heart were not frightening games, such as Castlevania and Splatterhouse. A notable title is Sega's Ghost House. At its heart, Ghost House is a platformer, but there are elements of evasion of enemies and avoidance of traps that are common in survival horror games. Also in the late 80s, Capcom released the game Sweet Home, an RPG that was a tie-in with the Japanese horror film of the same name. In this game, the player controls a party of characters. However, unlike most games, when a character died, in this game, they were gone permanently, with no way to bring them back. Shinji Mikami cited this game as a major influence of the Resident Evil games that he created. The first game to have a fully formed vision of what a survival horror game could be was the 1986 game Project Firestart, designed for the Commodore 64 by Jeff Tunnell. This game attempted to tap into the common horror themes of vulnerability and isolation. The graphic capability of the Commodore 64 was very limited, like most technology of the day. In the game, the player is limited in the power of the weapons he can use, and music is used to create suspense and panic by announcing the approach of a monster. The player has limited ammo and has to conserve it. The game has an element of open exploration, and there is a non-linear progression, as well as major adventure elements. The story is also progressed by the player reading journal entries and computer logs. These elements would become benchmarks of the survival horror genre. Though the game was met warmly with positive reviews, it failed to spawn imitators. In 1992, Alone in the Dark was released on the PC. This game, designed by Frederick Reinhold, was the first survival horror to use a 3D graphics engine. The game has a story rooted in the works of H.P. Lovecraft. In the game, the player can play as a male or female protagonist, trying to discover the mysteries behind the suicide of the previous owner of the Louisiana plantation house in which the story takes place. This game keeps an atmosphere of constant danger, relying on characters to be frightened more of what they can't see than what they can, while playing on the fear of the supernatural. This game also has all the conventions that had been established by Project Firestart, such as adventure and inventory puzzle solving. The game has had 3 sequels and a remake, none of which have been considered as good a game as the first. The second in particular is considered to be more campy than scary, with zombie mobsters and ghost pirates. 2 years after the release of Alone in the Dark, Shinji Mikami started work on Resident Evil, the game that would define the genre of survival horror. Resident Evil is the first game to coin the phrase survival horror, and is one of those games that people frequently remember knowing when they first played it that they were seeing something new for the first time. The game is heavily influenced by zombie fiction, and movies like Alien, Jaws, and Night of the Living Dead were also sources of inspiration. Rather than trying to have the cerebral horror of Alone in the Dark, Mikami wanted more of a bloody, visceral terror. The game capitalized on all of the qualities that made Alone in the Dark successful. Resident Evil had fixed cameras, pre-rendered backgrounds, and detailed 3D characters. The fixed camera took away some of the control from the player. The third-person perspective also added a further level of vulnerability by not allowing players to control their aim beyond the direction they are shooting. Furthermore, the player had to ration their ammo and other resources. The game kept elements such as reading the story through journal and log entries, and solving puzzles through the use of items collected in an inventory. Resident Evil eventually sold over 2.7 million copies and has had a prequel, several sequels, spin-offs, and even a remake. Resident Evil is the game that started the survival horror craze of the 90s. Clock Tower 2, or just Clock Tower in America, was a sequel to a Super Famicom game which players are stalked by a character known as Scissorman. Clock Tower was able to capitalize on the success of Resident Evil because it was released shortly after Resident Evil, when the demand for survival horror was high. The game incorporated a single enemy stalking you throughout the game, which would later be used by several other survival horror games. Also, during the interim between the first and second Resident Evil game, Final Fantasy VII was released. Due to its success, Squaresoft released Parasite Eve to capitalize both on the success of Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil. Parasite Eve had a character that grew and progressed like RPGs, but also had a horror story. Though it was a popular game with 2 sequels, it is not credited with the fear factor of most survival horror games. In early 1999, Konami released Silent Hill. Silent Hill is almost as synonymous with the survival horror genre as Resident Evil, and its sequels have stayed closer to the genre than those of Resident Evil. A notable development of Silent Hill is a protagonist that is not trained in combat like a soldier or police officer. In Silent Hill, the player controls Harry Mason, an everyman with no special training, who gets less accurate in his combat abilities as situations gain tension. It is also the first survival horror game that had a dynamic environment rather than pre-rendered rooms with fixed camera angles. Though thought by most critics to be the superior horror title, Silent Hill has never sold as well as the Resident Evil games. Later in 1999, Capcom released Dino Crisis. Dino Crisis was frequently called Resident Evil with dinosaurs, and the statement proved to be accurate. Though it had real-time 3D environments, the camera angles were fixed like those of Resident Evil. The biggest difference from Resident Evil was the monsters, which were fast dinosaurs rather than the slow and lumbering, mindless zombies. The game did well commercially and spawned 2 sequels, but was criticized for having more of an action element than horror. This game is looked at as the game that starts the mark of the decline of survival horror as a genre. As the next generation of gaming consoles started coming out, consumers and critics were beginning to notice that survival horror games were becoming formulaic and the demand for them was waning. Resident Evil Code Veronica was one of the more successful games on the Sega Dreamcast. The game was marked for better storytelling and cinematic presentation, but more of the same gameplay. No other survival horrors did as well on the Dreamcast. Code Veronica would eventually be ported to the PlayStation 2, where it gained a respectable amount of sales. In 2001, Fatal Frame was released, giving the genre a much-needed boost. In Fatal Frame, you are given the even more helpless character of a little girl going up against ghosts and spirits. Rather than being armed with any weapons, she's armed only with a camera that allows her to capture spirits for defense. This game borrowed from Japanese horror and has been a successful series with a few sequels. Regardless of Fatal Frame's success, the genre seemed to be dwindling until the release of System Shock 2. System Shock 2 showed that the content of the game was more important than the style. Rather than being a third-person action-adventure game like most survival horror games, System Shock was a first-person shooter. System Shock 2, though now recognized as a survival horror, was not considered one at its release. System Shock 2 was very much a genre-bending game, having the character growth of an RPG, the content of a survival horror, and the gameplay of an FPS. What made this game a successful horror was the 2 main themes that have frequently made games frightening: isolation and vulnerability. This was done by placing the character on a space station alone, surrounded by corpses and limited resources. The game also uses elements of lighting and sound to further the horror elements of the game. The next game that further showed the changing face of survival horror was another first-person shooter, id Software's Doom 3. Doom 3 borrowed many classic survival horror themes as well as horror elements in film. The most notable development in Doom 3 was its lighting engine, which is considered the best lighting engine up to that point, and allowed every surface to reflect light and cast shadows appropriate to a light source. This allowed for the creation of a very frightening atmosphere. The game used many survival horror elements, such as a story that is progressed by a collection of logs and journals to advance the story. It used classic Hollywood methods to frighten the gamer, such as monsters jumping out of unexpected places, disembodied voices, and poor environmental visibility. The player also had to balance the use of their flashlight with that of their weapons, creating a tension of helplessness, being able to see but unarmed, or being armed but unable to see. The game was a huge success, and though it was a step away from the action style of its own predecessors, it sold over 3.5 million copies. Resident Evil 4 was a complete reinvention of the Resident Evil series. In this game, the view changed to a third-person view over the shoulder, rather than being a third-person view looking down on the character. The monsters in this game were reimagined, and had the ability to communicate with one another, plan against the player, and move swiftly, unlike the zombies of previous Resident Evil games. The game was a grand commercial success, outselling all of its predecessors. Its sequel, Resident Evil 5, had the same mechanic with a two-player cooperative element. However, although the games represented a strong step for the third-person shooter, they were criticized because they were becoming more action games than horror games. Fear, First Encounter Assault Recon, was released in 2005. It was another first-person shooter with an action horror approach. The game has strong influences of J-horror. Though the game didn't break any new ground, it was well polished and well received and has been successful enough to have 2 sequels. Condemned, Criminal Origins, was released the same year as Fear and is considered to be one of the most terrifying games ever made. Rather than having conventional monsters, the game goes into the twisted world of serial killers and thugs. This game is notable for having no ammo pickups whatsoever, and once the main character, Ethan Thomas, runs out of ammo, he is forced to use melee weapons throughout the game. This game differs from most survival horrors because in this game, the main character is not so much escaping, but increasingly being trapped by his loosening grip on sanity. Deep Space again returned players to space. This game has the everyman fighting again, Isaac Clarke, an engineer stranded on a mining vessel. In this game, the player is fighting against powerful alien monsters ranging in all sizes. It featured the lighting engine of Doom 3. This game is made notable by its addition of trying to perform precise tasks under imminent threat. Specifically, the players have to shoot off the limbs of the monsters in the game in order to defeat them. Survival horror continues to progress as a genre that is more defined by theme than by any specific gameplay mechanic. There are many notable contemporary titles, such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent, where the player controls an amnesiac man, armed only with a lantern and a loose grip on reality, who is fleeing from a monster while following his quest. Games such as this exemplify what makes games frightening: isolation, helplessness, the act of being pursued or hunted, and the loss of sanity. As technology progresses, so will the ability of the game to frighten the user.